Mosquitoes, Mozambique. How we collectively itch under their collective whine. All night insects thicken round the clinic's outdoor light. In the malaria ward, the beds are pushed so close the sleepers share the same bad dream. A female mosquito filling her soft bulb, dipping her beak for a drop of blood to ripen her eggs, how her abdomen's rosé flush deepens to ruby as she siphons out water as waste. The sleepers parch. Over at the NGO dorm, we swap mosquito lore like cards. They become accustomed to, or are indifferent to, or possibly mock citronella. They'll find a way in. Even the smallest tear in a mosquito net is an open door, and your body is a welcome mat on which they wipe their feet before inserting a straw. They use 2 serrated needles to cut through your tissues. 2 needles to hold the flesh apart, 1 to insert a chemical spit to keep your blood running, and a proboscis to home in, to suck. Their eyesight's alleged to be poor. They see you better when you move, and are attracted to blondes and restless sleepers. They smell your breath. Some of us smell sweeter. I'm one of their chosen ones and verge on paranoia. Long sleeves, trousers tucked into socks after dark, a cotton scarf to protect the back of my neck. My lips tingle with DEET. If I lick them, my tongue bitters and numbs. I brush at my face obsessively, keep my feet tucked under me and chafe. I'm not the only one. Out on the veranda, the Dutch intern swipes an electric racket through the air. Every time it intercepts an insect, it makes an exaggerated buzz. It pleases him to hear them frizz, to imagine their bodies forked in hot blue light as they electrocute and spasm. Like DEET, his bat is indiscriminate and zaps fruit flies, crane flies, moths, beetles on the wing. Think of insecticides sprayed over cities from planes, falling mist fine over ditches, a soft, particulate rain. The sweltering night suddenly quiet in the city park, the frogs' pale bellies moonside up, snakes like sloppy inner tubes rotting in the grass. And think of Honesty's daughter, hallucinating in bed, as Honesty loosens her cornrows with trembling fingers and sings to her in undertones collapsed by her own uneven breath, the nearest clinic hours away on broken roads. The malaria swells and burns till her girl arches from her pallet bed and drums her heels, her eyes roll back in her head, raised beyond and gone, though her mother tries to call her home. Daughter, baby girl. It makes me sick to write this, as if I make it happen. But every 2 minutes, a child. Survivors sway in the open bed of the hired trucks, ululating and screaming as they rattle to the burial ground. Meanwhile, Imo Hansen, gentle professor, inserts his naked wrist through the sleeved net tunnel of a mosquito incubator, a special iridescent species, and suffers them to feed, keeps steady despite the itch, because these rainforest jewels might have secrets to tell. And in London, a woman splices a mosquito egg to corrupt the gene that defines male sex. There will be infertile males, and in 8 generations, a matter of days, the brood will collapse. Still, my architect friend on the Ilia sleeps in one bed with his Mozambican wife and sons. He jolts awake every few minutes to check that his wife and boy's beloved flesh isn't touching the net or near the net or within arm's length of the net, where he imagines a mosquito might intrude its long needle. Again and again he shuffles them in, till they sleep in a riddled heap at the centre of the bed, swimming in the vast margins of his terror. I don't have children yet, though I have miscarried, and hold myself like a crystal glass, full to the brim, afraid to spill, afraid to harm a single ovum. When I am feverish, I take myself to the hospital and queue to have my finger pricked in the whitewashed clinic. Hundreds of mothers mill outside the slow pharmacy. Pills are passed at intervals through a metal grill. Babies are weighed from clock-faced scales suspended from the ceiling, lain in dangling, knotted slings. The way in old cartoons, newborns are brought in bundles, hanging from a stork's beak, the longed-for gift. The man driven insane by dysentery, turmeric yellow shit dribbling down his leg, stirs in the hospital garbage with a stick and won't let anyone come near. My name is called. I've tested negative and can go. I walk, shaking with relief and fever, back to the dorm, back through aircon buses and airports and planes, back to my privileged Northern Isle, in which my babies will be inoculated against most ills, and God willing, inshallah, whatever it takes I will give, will live. I do not deserve this life.
My name is Richard Lane. I'm a scientist and I've spent most of my career working on insects of medical importance, mosquitoes, black flies and sandflies. Most of us know about mosquitoes because they bite people, and of course they're infamous because of the diseases that they transmit. Most important by a long way is malaria, but they also transmit a number of other quite devastating diseases, from dengue, which is very debilitating, even if it doesn't kill you like malaria does, and there are a whole range of other viruses. And what's become very interesting in the last 30 to 40 years is that many of these viruses that we used to think of as being tropical viruses, restricted to different parts of Africa, for example, just think of Zika virus, all over South America, that actually is named after the Zika forest in Uganda, where it was originally found. And certainly 30 years ago, when I first started teaching students, we used to teach them about these strange viruses from Africa. And now, of course, you have to teach them that these viruses occur everywhere. But of course, the most important of all diseases that mosquitoes transmit is malaria. And malaria affects hundreds of millions of people a year. We used to say about 1 person every 10 seconds is dying of malaria. I'm pleased to say that number's come down, and it's come down to about 1 a minute. Much of that impact has been by controlling the mosquitoes, and main methods of controlling them now are by using insecticide impregnated bed nets. So as the person sleeps underneath a bed net, the mosquito comes to feed on them and then picks up a lethal dose of insecticide on the bed net. And these are really fantastic insecticides because they have very low toxicity to people and quite high toxicity to mosquitoes. But of course, because they've got high toxicity to mosquitoes, that also means that the mosquitoes eventually become resistant. And that's one of our big struggles, is to try and find new kinds of insecticides that we can use to control the mosquitoes. So malaria is beginning to decrease around the world. Fewer countries have malaria than they did even 15 years ago. So we can see that we can make an impact, but that leaves an enormous number of people with malaria. Most of them are children, and most of them are in sub-Saharan Africa, and most of them are poor. Mm-hmm. Interesting enough, malaria isn't a disease of poverty like many other infections you get in the tropics, but people unable to protect their homes, unable to live in very sophisticated houses. Air conditioning is really, really good for reducing malaria, because it means people are excluded from the outside world at the times when the mosquitoes are biting. And so that's obviously related to how wealthy you are. One thing I've always been very interested in is how people get infections from blood-sucking insects. That actually means you need to go to where those people live. And it makes it very interesting because you can study the natural history, so to speak, of the people, of the mosquitoes, of the parasites, and sometimes there's a wild animal reservoir as well. So you need to look at those 4 different things and where they all overlap. So really then getting just specifically about mosquitoes, there are about 3,500 different kinds of mosquitoes around the world. About 30 of them occur in the UK. They're incredibly diverse, even though we think of them rather simply as things that suck our blood and extremely annoying. Some of them actually, of the tropical ones, don't feed on blood at all. They only feed on plant sugars. And they've got really beautifully curved proboscis that they can get into the flowers to feed on them. They're also particularly beautiful because they're covered in metallic scales, those ones. One of the interesting things to remember about mosquitoes is that it's only the female mosquito that bites, and she's feeding on blood in order to get enough proteins and fats to produce eggs. And usually, not entirely always, but usually 1 blood meal is required for 1 batch of eggs. And what we're interested in, not so much in the biology of the flies, but in the biology of how the parasites get transmitted, is how long the females live and how often they are able to feed. So the number of blood meals and therefore egg batches they're going to produce. The number of blood meals is important because obviously if they feed on a person with malaria parasites, those parasites need to develop in the mosquito before the mosquito bites another person and is able to transmit the parasite. So how long they live in between is really crucial to understand how diseases are transmitted. Taking blood, interestingly enough, is actually quite difficult stuff to deal with, because just think that blood clots. And so if you're an animal with a very thin tube at the front of you to suck the blood, and it clots in the feeding tube, it's not going to be a good plan, is it? So mosquitoes have a huge number of biologically active substances that they inject with the saliva as and when they are feeding, with anticoagulants, vasodilators to increase the number the amount of leaking from blood vessels. They also have anesthetics and quite a lot of molecules inside the mosquito to deal with the toxins that are in blood. Blood is actually quite toxic to feed on. It's actually quite difficult to digest because they're obviously full of lots of proteases, and those proteases are quite toxic to insects that feed on them. when the mosquito's feeding, it is able to actually bend the feeding tube very slightly when it's actually in the host, and to try and get as close as possible to a blood vessel. Other kinds of blood-sucking flies, like midges that people are very familiar with, they have a slightly different approach, and they've got a pair of little mandibles that work like scissors, and they just cut a small hole, and they also inject vasodilators for the tiny microcapillaries to leak, and then blood leaks into the little hole they've made, and then they suck up the blood like a little well you've just dug in the ground or something. So, and they're actually quite sophisticated in how they can do. People know that mosquitoes are seeking us out all the time, and that some people seem to be more attractive to mosquitoes than others. And this is actually true. You can do experiments to show that different people have attractions. So mosquitoes are actually tracking us down by the heat we're giving off, so they've got very good infrared detectors, by the CO2 that we go off when we're breathing, and of course loads of other chemicals that we're giving off from our skin and the like, and they are using all those different bits of information in trying to find their host. And remember that they're doing this in the dark usually, so sight is not really of much use at all. They work by following what we call an odour plume. So as we're sitting in a room, we can produce small currents of air from the heat of our bodies, and the mosquitoes track along those little air circulations. Outside, they can pick us up from several hundred meters away by these chemicals that we give off, the CO2 and the body chemicals, and they can pick up minute quantities of these chemicals in the air, and they fly up the plume, and they keep crossing it backwards and forwards, and they're measuring the concentration of these what are now quite rare molecules in the air, and that's how they find us. So they're incredibly good at doing that. The other point is that some people do get bitten more than others, and also some people react more to the mosquitoes. Mosquitoes have these various substances in their saliva, and that's what gives us these bumps and itches. And it's always a good plan, I think, to find someone who's particularly attractive to mosquitoes and sit next to them.